Hello and welcome to Colleague 7 Sprint Review for 19.03.02. This will cover the work undertaken between the 19th of March to the 1st of April. We start with our sprint goal, and for this sprint it has been to enhance the Colleague 7 API further with the addition of links to download existing documents stored against the candidate record. Also to complete the second phase of the bank details feature by including this option against the placement entity. Looking at the high-level items and to explain further, in this sprint we've been able to enhance our API with an additional method so that third parties can call and receive a list of documents associated to a candidate record. This is with then a link to download each document. There are also security settings in place to allow a client the ability to define which document types are accessible to the API and which are not. We've delivered the first phase of background service related work to enhance the performance of the system when processing email sending from a search result. The second phase will be part of the next sprint as a key sprint goal. Further to the work carried out in the previous sprint, we've added the bank details feature to the placement entity, and I'll give a demo of this feature shortly. The interview workflow has been updated so that the interview type will be automatically incremented based on the previous interviews. This is based on the sequencing order of the interview type lookup. Again, I'll give a demo on this shortly. We've resolved an issue with certain skills failing to be parsed when parsing a candidate's CV. This is now a revised solution that performs a non-case sensitive match on the skill description. We've updated the discard and update feature so that the date sent option is given to the user. This is to cater for instances where you wish to backdate when you sent the CV to a prior date from today. And we've provided an option to set the team overview as the default landing page. We'll now go through a brief demonstration on the key features from this sprint. Okay, so the first point I wanted to go through was the bank details feature that's been added to the placement entity. So just as a recap, as part of the last sprint, we added bank details as an option to candidates and companies. So against the candidates entity off the View More menu, you've got bank details as an option here, and you can click on that. It will bring down a partial view with a table, and that will essentially contain all of the bank details that you've added respective to these fields. Whether or not you can view bank details is dependent on these user group permissions, which are available within the admin area. So you've got option here to view bank details, you've got option to add or edit bank details, and here you've got an option to view bank details against the placement, which is the new setting that's been added. So within the candidate, you've obviously got this option. Within the company, again, you've got the same option. With the company, this is more on the scenarios of when you have a limited company against the candidate for storing bank details there. So that's now stored. So against the placement on the back office tab, what you have under payment details is you've got bank details as an option there that's now available. And again, this is on the basis, whether you see this is on the basis of that user group permission we just covered there. So what you'll do is you click on to select bank detail. That will bring down the bank detail. Whether or not that bank detail is stored against the candidate or the company will depend on whether or not you have an assigned limited company. So in this scenario, we've got a limited company against this candidate, but also we've got obviously the candidate record as well that we're associated. So it's going to list all bank details that are associated to the limited company and the candidate. In this case, we've got two examples here. But we can select one of those bank details and hit select there, and that will now be assigned against this record as that associated bank detail. And if you wanted to clear it, you could just hit the cross there to clear it down, and if you wanted to select another, that it's done. So bank details essentially are now associated against this record. If you didn't have permissions to view that bank detail, as we would expect would be the case for multiple users in the business, then you with that permission turned off against the user group, what that will mean is within the back office tab against the placement entity, you'll see this. So against bank details, you do not have access to view bank details is what the user will see. So for everyone that obviously has permission to view bank details, they'll see what we just went through. For others that don't, they'll see this message. But that was essentially the key update in relation to bank details that was done in this sprint. The next point to go through is the update we made to the discard and update option that's available when you're sending a CV from the system. So this is relevant when you're sending a spec CV, but also when you're sending a CV from a requirement as well. We'll demonstrate it from the candidate record in the process of sending a spec CV. But obviously you have spec CV sent tab. You'll see the list of spec CVs that have been sent currently, but obviously there could be a scenario where you've sent a spec CV to a contact, but you've not done it from the system for whatever reason. You've done it just straight out of Outlook, say. And what you want to do is retrospectively make that update in the system to advise that you've sent a spec CV. So the discard and update option is used in this scenario. What used to happen is on pressing discard and update, it would record that the spec CV was sent, but it would set it as of today's date as being the date with the spec CV was sent, whereas now on pressing discard and update, you'll get a date sent option here, and it'll be defaulted to today's date, but what you can obviously do is choose to change that date to be, say, the 2nd, and then on hitting save, that's now going to process the discard and update as if you've just sent that spec CV or you sent that spec CV on that date that you specified. If we go to the spec CV sent tab, I'll just refresh the candidate, and what you'll see is the new entry against the spec CV tab is basically advising the date sent as being the 2nd of April that you can see there. So that's the contact that we just sent to. So you've got an ability now to kind of retrospectively advise a spec CV that's gone out the door, or a CV that's gone out the door on a date prior to today's date, and that was the key update that we made there. The next point to go through is with regards to the default interview settings that have been enabled against the requirement entity as part of this sprint. And when I say default interview settings, what I'm really referring to is the interview type, which is assigned against an interview. So to explain what I mean, obviously we're in a requirement here against the candidates tab. If we go to set up an interview, as part of this form loading, what would always been the case is that the interview type would have been set to first interview, and you would then need to select which type of interview it now is in terms of the number of times this interview is now taking place for the candidate against this requirement. What a natural expectation would be that the interview type would naturally increment to the next interview along based on how many interviews you have had against that requirement. So what we have implemented now are a set of controls which basically govern that. So within the admin area under lookups and under interview type, what you can now do against these different interview types that you have within here is you've got an option in here to include in default interview sequence. So what it's going to do is it's going to be looking at the sequence number of these interviews. So obviously you could add in your own interviews if you've got pre-screening that is happening in any way, or other ways that you're looking to interview the candidate ahead of an interview taking place actually with the client. You obviously have your own interview types within here, but you have essentially a sequencing order that you need to assign against these interviews. And based on this sequencing order, this is what the process is going to look for. It's also going to check that you've obviously got this include in default interview sequence set to yes. So based on this sequencing order and based on the default, include default interview sequence being set to yes, it will then increment the interview as per what you've set up in this area against this interview lookup. So if we go back to the requirement, if I create an interview against, say, this candidate as an example, so this is obviously a first interview, we'll set that to be for today at 12 o'clock, say, as an example. I'll just hit save there. And what you can see now is obviously we have an interview there that's set up. Also, there's been a tooltip that's enabled now. So on mousing over the date, you'll see the actual interview type displayed as a tooltip there. And that will be the same, obviously, for all the different dates that obviously are assigned here. So you've got a feel for what interviews have been on. But if we wanted to, say, interview this candidate again, obviously this candidate has been on this interview. Let's say that we want to set them up for another interview now. Let's set arrange interview, and obviously the interview type is incremented to the second interview. So on this basis, let's now put it, I don't know, say the 8th, and we'll say 11 o'clock, save. And then obviously now we've got a second interview that's now in play. If we arranged a third, now increments to third interview. And again, we switch up to whatever day is associated to that, and so on and so forth. But that essentially means that you've now got that automatic incrementation of interviews. That explains how what dictates those being the interview type, and that obviously then addresses issues with regards to reporting in terms of interviews always appearing as first interview if users are obviously running the interview and then never updating this field. So that was the key update that we made with regards to default interview settings. The last point to go through is with regards to the default landing page and whether you want that to be the user overview or the team overview. So historically, the user overview has always been the default landing page when you've logged into Colleague 7 or when you've clicked on the Colleague 7 icon top left. And you've had this team overview as an option to slide over to, and that's obviously given you that report output. We've had requests from various clients asking for team overview to be their default landing page. So there's now the setting to do that. So this is a global setting and a user setting. Global setting obviously assigning for all, user settings being an option to override that global setting specifically for that user. So within user settings under system, what you'll have is an option here to choose whether or not you want the user overview or the team overview to be your default landing page. What we'll do is we'll switch that to team overview. Also note there are the additional options that were added as part of the last sprint. So you've got an option here for defining the default date range, which is assigned against the report, and also whether or not the report runs automatically by default, or whether or not you need to trigger it to run manually. So we'll set that to yes, so it runs automatically. Exclude subteams, we will leave as no, and we'll put the date range as being say this week. So if we now go back to here and let's click on Colleague 7, it will be as if we've logged in. What you'll see is the team overview is now the default landing page. The report is obviously triggered to run as per that setting, and then the team overview output is obviously then displayed. So this is obviously more tuned to perhaps managerial users or users that are just generally more interested in a team overview setup as opposed to looking at the specific user overview that you would get as you log in previously. But that's the key update we made there. As always, if you have any queries or feedback, please get in touch. I'll be keen to hear from you. Also, for those using Colleague 7, feel free to submit your enhancement requests via the support team or directly to me using the above email address. The next video will be the sprint plan for 19.04.01, and as always, that will contain a high-level overview on the items we intend to work on during that sprint. Thanks for watching.